Yeah, we're not going on YouTube, Jack. Thanks, Jack.
All right, so we just get the
Demonetized.
To start off in this unit, so we already covered in seventh grade. You guys studied a lot of ecology, so we'll go into a little bit more depth here. But actually, on the Regents exam, it's about the level of depth that you did in seventh grade. So to start off, and we'll come back to this, and we actually have an activity about this this concept. In Yellowstone National Park, the oldest national park in the world, wolves were native to that area. Wolves were native to much of the northern parts of North America and Canada. However, in lots of parts, in all of the United States actually, wolves were hunted to extinction. So about 1920 or so, all wolves in Yellowstone National Park were basically wiped out. Does anyone know why? Why did people hunt wolves?
Didn't we do this in seventh grade?
Gabe?
Because they kill a lot of their livestock and cattle.
Yes, so some wolves were thought of at the time especially as sort of like a, almost like a nuisance species. They did, so in Wyoming, that part of the country, there's a lot of ranching, people raising animals for livestock. Sometimes wolves would prey on livestock. Probably not a ton, but that was the impression that people had. So often people, if they saw wolves, would shoot them, would kill them. So they were basically eliminated from the national park in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And after that, so subsequent to the elimination of wolves from those areas, there were a lot of changes to the ecosystem. And they're not changes that you might think about as an immediate consequence of the removal of the wolves. One thing that happened is soil erosion increased dramatically once the wolves were eliminated from the park. Here you see a picture with the exposed roots of this tree that were once deep in the soil, but because of the erosion along that riverbank, they're all exposed here. So how are those things connected? An ecologist would study sort of these connections within an ecosystem. Anyone have any ideas about that? Ian?
Well, I know why.
You already know why?
Yeah, it's because of all the buffalo that are trampling along the waterbeds and around on the ground and it eroded away the soil, and they weren't being killed by the wolves, therefore they allowed the population to grow.
Okay, so you're saying it's like one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which led to soil erosion? So yeah, you're pretty close there. We'll talk more about this, but in ecology, you study the connections between different types of organisms. And often what you'll find is that the removal or the addition of a species into a certain area has effects that you might not have predicted, and this would be one of those. So in the middle of the 1990s, they actually reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone. It was pretty controversial still at the time, but they took and released 14 wolves into the park. They took them from different packs. They weren't all from one pack. They took 14 wolves from separate packs so they could establish sort of a healthy population and release them into Yellowstone. There's now a thriving population of gray wolves in the park. And there's also been changes to some of these things like soil erosion and other things since their reintroduction. We'll talk more about that probably next week. All right, so let's talk about some ecology. When we, what's that?
You like looked over the board and wow.
So,
It was a good one. It was a good one.
when we study ecology, ecology is looking at how organisms and their non-living environment interact with each other. The connections between living and non-living things. So ecologists can look at sort of different parts of the earth, and some ecologists might focus on very large areas, others might focus on very specific areas. So we could break down the earth into sort of these categories that get smaller and smaller as we move down. The largest of those is the biosphere. basically when we use the term biosphere, we're talking about the entire portion of the earth where there are living organisms. So that goes, high into the atmosphere, covers all of the surface of the earth, into the oceans, into the deepest parts of the oceans where you have strange organisms living in deep sea vents. All of that sort of outer layer of the earth where there are living things, we call that the biosphere. That biosphere is broken up into large areas that we call biomes. A biome is an ecosystem that has similar characteristics. All deserts have certain characteristics. All tropical rainforests, they have certain characteristics. Typically, the type of biome that forms in an area is dependent on the conditions present, mainly temperature and moisture. Examples might be the tundra, a biome that forms under very cold conditions when there's relatively little precipitation, or the grassland or tropical rainforest. What biome do we live in? If you abandon, let's say, your house in your backyard for 500 years and we come back, what's going to be there?
Swamp.
Depends, I guess, depends on where you actually live in terms of geography. For most of it, our area, it would be a forest. It would be, we call it a temperate deciduous forest. That's because of the temperature, the seasonal nature of where we live, the amount of precipitation. That's the kind of ecosystem that forms here. If you go north a ways, it might be a boreal forest. If you go farther north, it might be the tundra. If you go south, it would be a different types of ecosystem. So an ecosystem is basically a collection of, within a specific area, a group of organisms and their physical environment interacting. The Adirondack Mountains would be one large ecosystem. Lake Michigan, the Utica Marsh. In those areas, we have both a variety of living creatures, some non-living things that all interact with each other. Further breaking down an ecosystem, we could talk about the community. That includes only the living things. The community of Lake George would be all the fish and amphibians and bacteria and protists that are living in the lake. And then our smallest level here that we have listed is a population. In ecology, if you're speaking about a population, you're referring to a single specific species, one species in a given ecosystem. If you think about the small forests that are around our school, we can talk about the population of white-tailed deer in that ecosystem. We can study that population. So in just sort of a pictorial form, here we have, the smallest group, just one individual organism, a group of those organisms living together in an area, a population. Many populations living together form a community. The community, along with the non-living parts of the environment, make up that ecosystem. A bunch of these ecosystems form biomes, which then all together form the biosphere. So one important topic that ecologists study is called population dynamics. And so population of organisms is often limited. In a given ecosystem, there's a limit to the number of individuals that can survive in that ecosystem. And those factors that control the size of the population, we call them limiting factors. They limit the size of the population. And sometimes they're non-living factors. Things like the amount of sunlight, the pH of the water, the pH of the soil, the oxygen levels, the the amount of rainfall. Those would be non-living factors, but they influence the size of a population. They limit the size of a population. Other limiting factors might be biotic, living in nature. Things like the number of predators often controls the number of prey species that can live in an area. Food is considered a biotic factor because it's living. Competition within a species is a biotic factor. So all those things can limit how large a population can be. We have a term for the maximum population that can be supported in a given ecosystem is called its carrying capacity. So we could talk about, for example, in the courtyard, the carrying capacity of our courtyard for gray squirrels, maybe it's 14. That the ecosystem in the middle of school, maybe we could say could support 14 gray squirrels. There's not enough food to support any more than that. Food might be a limiting factor. Here's another example. This is a population of deer on an island over a period of time. Okay. So you see obviously the population of deer started off relatively low and then grew over time. What would you say is the carrying capacity of this Walla Walla island for 4 white-tailed deer? 97?
80.
What do you say, Luke?
80.
80?
78.
Yeah, which one of those do you think is correct?
Yeah, 80.
Why, Jack?
Because it doesn't, like, when it gets up to 97, it doesn't stay there.
Right. So yeah, the carrying capacity is probably a little under 80. And what you see is sometimes populations do exceed the carrying capacity, but there's not enough resources. There's some limiting factor, and so they come back down. Now, typically, lots of species will stay around the carrying capacity. Okay. Now, there might be some factor. Maybe all of a sudden more food was available. The carrying capacity might increase. Or something else might happen, the carrying capacity might decrease. It can change over time. But typically, many species will, their population size will stay around. All right, this is our last slide for today. So there are, when we think about population dynamics, ecologists talk about species and their strategies for survival in 2 sort of categories. Some species are called R-selected species, and some are K-selected species. So if we think about 2 organisms, let's say white-tailed deer and brook trout, two species that live in the same sort of ecosystems, maybe. So how is their reproductive strategy different? So to maintain a population of white-tailed deer and to maintain a population of brook trout, what are the differences in how those 2 things reproduce? Okay?
Usually the brook trout will actually all the time the brook trout will lay like usually hundreds of eggs, and the deer usually reproduce singularly.
Okay, so number of offspring is a big difference between those 2 things. White-tailed deer will have, usually 2 offspring a year, whereas the trout will lay hundreds, thousands even of eggs that could hatch into young every year. So that's one big difference. What's another one, Brian? Okay. One's in the water, one is on land. What else is different about those? Okay, but how about in terms of their reproduction? Like about their reproduction in the raising of young? Yeah, deer invest a lot of resources in taking care of their offspring. So the doe will stay around the fawns for a while. They'll go and they'll help them find food and put them in a little hiding space, things like that. So there's a lot of parental investment in the young. How about in the trout? There's none. Which one do you think has a higher percentage of survival? Obviously the deer would have a much higher rate of survival. So both of these strategies, however, can maintain a population. So the deer would be an example of a K-selected species. a species that generally stays around the carrying capacity. Okay? They often don't produce as many offspring, but they invest a lot of energy in caring for them. They don't usually just have a few. They typically reproduce more slowly. They usually live longer. Those are K-selected species. They maintain relatively stable populations. If you think about the trout would be what we call an R-selected species. Okay? It's limited by its reproductive rate, whereas the trout lays a ton of eggs that hatch, population goes up, but how many of them survive? A very small percentage, and so the population dies off. And so you have this sort of ebb and flow of the population size over time. They put no energy into raising their young. Basically lay the eggs and then they're left there. Okay? So those are sort of two different strategies of how a species can maintain its population. And there's lots of things in between. It's not everything is either R or K selected, but those are sort of the two opposing sides of those adaptations for survival. Katie? What would you say?
Like, we increase our population but what we do
So we have a lot of members of our species that are reproduced, and our population is growing quickly. But yeah, we would definitely be a K-selected species where we put a huge amount of resources into raising our young until they're independent. We have very high survival rates of our young compared to species that produce many, many offspring. All right, so we'll stop there for today. Any questions about that? All right, good job, period A. You have a video.